Would you pray with me a moment? Open my lips that my mouth might show forth your praise. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight. O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Here in the church, we welcome infants carried to us in their parents' arms. We welcome them to baptize the little precious ones. And they come, and they're truly perfect. The Hebrew word is shalom. They're whole, without flaw or injury of mind or spirit. And all these children, these infants who come to be baptized, all they need in life are three things. Love. Love which they can see in the eyes and hear in the voice of their mothers and their fathers. And they need a physical connection which they feel in being held close by the people who love them. And they need to be cared for and fed. And so their parents come and stand beside me and Kayla and a deacon of the church, and we bless the child. But I myself am always struck by a recognition of the pre-existing blessedness, the goodness of God. And when I pray that that blessedness might be preserved, and that blessedness in that child might in turn bless me, and bless our community, and bless our world. Now, those of us who were baptized a long time ago know that life does not stop at the font. Like Jesus, we go out into the wilderness of life. And all of us live lives in the midst of brokenness and imperfection. And we grow up missing the things that we needed as infants. That love, that connection, and care. Our world might have people in it who withhold their love or are unable to love. Rather than being held and embraced by people, we might be hit or yelled at. Rather than being close, we might have people in our life who are distant, who don't care or can't care. People who leave us and abandon us and reject us and betray us. We go out from the font as beautiful little children and have people say, four eyes, or fatty, or dumbbell, or klutz, or nerd, or gimp, or loser. And if we're a young girl who grows up to be a woman, we discover that for many people we're just an object, a bimbo or frigid, someone who anyone can touch or abuse or violate, who might not get a job they deserve just because they're a woman. Or if we're a little brown or black or yellow child and go out into the world, we hear the word nigger. And we realize that by the color of our skin, we are someone that is hated and feared. An object to be used and upon whom violence is okay. Or if we grow up to discover that we are gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgendered and people tell us we are sick, not normal. You cannot be who you are, fag, dyke, weirdo. Or we serve our country and we go off into a war and we see and do terrible things. Or we live a place and we get mugged or robbed. or we live in a violent place and it leaves scars on our souls. My friends, what I'm describing is called trauma. And we know that a head trauma, a trauma to the head, causes an inability to think, an inability to remember, an inability to process reasonably. But traumas to our souls also leave scars. They leave us unable to love, unable to care, unable to connect, leave us full of fear and anxiety and prejudice and hatred. And we often don't even know why, because it was just the air we breathed as children. And it burned into our very souls. All of this is a long way of bringing you to the point of this sermon. 2020 and now 2021 have been years of trauma, where old injuries are boiling up all around us and new scars and inabilities are being left in their wake. I'll start with this week at the United States Capitol. My boys called me, and I was working on a very different sermon at my desk. My boy said, "You got to see this, Dad." And I walked in and I saw hangmen's nooses. People came to lynch Mr. Pence and Mrs. Pelosi. People calling for blood. People wearing shirts with anti-Semitic words on it. People carrying Confederate flags and all that that thing stands for in the history of our nation. Now, I'm not talking about the judicial consequences or the political meaning of what happened, but here, my friends, is the spirituality of what is going on. The people who climbed those walls are trauma victims. They're scarred. Now, we'll never know their life stories, why they feel like their country is being taken from them, why they still feel angry about losing the Civil War, why they feel angry that their slaves were taken from them. But as a pastor, I was taught that it is the one who was hit who hits. It is the child who was abused who grows up to be an abuser. It is the person who lives in a sea of anger who goes out into the world angry. And one thing all of us know, this is not fake news, this is the truth, is that those people who stormed the Capitol have been bathing not in holy water, but in a sea of lies and anger and conspiracy and scapegoating for at least the last 4 years. And it has become like a blunt force trauma to their heads. And they are no longer able to think or process like others who have not lived in the world in which they live. I will go so far as to say that our president is clearly a trauma victim. Where else does all his mendacity and his ugliness and his violence and his betrayal come from, if not that it was inflicted on him at some point? But last week was just last week. Before that, we watched George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery be killed. And we heard about Breonna Taylor's death at the hands of the police. And for the African American community, it was yet another repeat of 400 years of trauma of being a black person in the United States. And for some of us who live in places like Dover, it was a moment where our eyes were opened and we finally understood. But for black people, it was just too much. And they marched and they protested and they demanded. And unlike the guys who walked into the Capitol who just sort of walked in, the black protesters were met with the normative white response of violence and dismissal and mischaracterization. And more trauma piled up. And finally, or at least maybe enough for this one sermon, all of us have been living in the trauma of COVID. A world of isolation when we're meant to be together. A world of fear that someone might be endangering our lives. A world where people are losing their work and their life savings and the opportunities they have. A world where children are getting less of an education. A world where all of us have, to one degree or another, been living in solitary confinement for 10 months. And we know now what it's like to be a prisoner. It's called being stir crazy, and it's a trauma because we just want to fly and be free. But we feel our souls inside us darting like a little bird, causing havoc. And my friends, all of this trauma, what we saw this week in Washington, D.C., what we saw over the summer and in the fall with the Black Lives Matter movement, and what we know in our lives through COVID is affecting all of us. We each have our individual trauma, but then we have these traumatic pathologies running around our country. The white supremacist anger, the African American experience, and all of us in fear for our lives, which is why we need healing. Why, my friends, today and every day, we need to be reminded of who we really are, and we need to remind ourselves of the healing waters of our baptisms. Because if you turn on the news, you see and hear and feel the trauma. Some people call it madness because that's what it feels like. And it's all around us, nibbling at our souls, grabbing our attention and holding us and calling to us, tempting us like the devil tempted Jesus, urging us to do trauma to one another in word or deed. And instead of running into the streets or damning someone, I am a beloved child of God, called to live peace and justice and reconciliation and forgiveness and inclusion. That's who I am. It takes more than a dash of water to do that for me. I need to breathe. The story of Jesus' baptism, immediately followed by his being driven into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil, is, my friends, a story that is so very true for us right now. It's what we see all around us. I've called it societal trauma. In other churches, they might call it the devil. But whatever it is, it's tempting us to more trauma, to cycle through again and continue. To use those gnawings of anger and fear and distrust and bitterness and resentment to be who we aren't and to do what God forbids us. Come on down to the Capitol. Let's get some revenge. Stand up for white supremacy. Stand up for anti-Semitism. Stand up for the oppression of women and gays and lesbians and transgendered and Mexicans and immigrants and Muslims. My friends, this is not a rational thing we're talking about. These are powerful emotions and motivations surging deep inside our neighbors' souls and in our very souls. And so it's very easy for our country to lose its way. But as people who have been in the water, we cannot rush along with the crowd. We cannot call the others stupid or fools or possessed. First, we must free ourselves. Return to the healing waters and say, "Yes, Lord, not me. That's not who I am, and that's not what I do. I'm a beloved child of God who wants and longs and will live peace and justice and reconciliation and forgiveness and inclusion." Because it is only with our hearts cleansed in that way that we can look at people who do things that we despise, that we fear, and remember that they too are beloved children of God. But we are not here to convert them to our religion. We are here to live our religion with them. The word religion, religio, means to rebind, to reconnect. And all of these traumas of the 400 years of the American experience, which have never been healed, are pulling us apart. And the truth about trauma, my friends, is we can heal. When we live trauma, that's when we are brittle and broken and oh so easily breakable. But once healed, we are more resilient and flexible and pliable. My friends, all of the healthiest parts of my soul are the ones that have been healed of trauma. And the ones that are unhealed are where you will find my rough edges, my jagged spots, where I might be quick to lash out or hit back. As I said before, this is not a judicial or a political sermon, as in what should our country do now. It's about how you and I and all people who have been to the water are to live. Who we truly are, how we proclaim ourselves to be, how we long to be people bathed in the waters of baptism and living in love. We've been hearing stories about Jesus healing hands. Well, now the ball's in our hands. God help us. Amen.